Scripture today is kind of an unusual one. It comes from Habakkuk. We're going to hear this in a special translation. So if you're following along in the pews, you're going to see different words, hear different words. This comes from the Message version of the Bible. The problem, as God gave Habakkuk to see it. God, how long do I have to cry out for help before you listen? How many times do I have to yell, help, murder, police, before you come to the rescue? Why do you force me to look at evil and stare trouble in the face day after day? Anarchy and violence break out, quarrels and fights all over the place. Law and order fall to pieces. Justice is a joke. What's God going to say to these questions? I'm braced for the worst. I climb to the watchtower and scan the horizon. I'll wait to see what God says, how he'll answer my complaint, and then God answered. Write this. Write it in big letters. Write it out in big block letters so it can be read on the run. This vision message is a witness pointing to what's coming. It aches for the coming. It can hardly wait, and it doesn't lie. If it seems slow in coming, wait. It's on the way. It'll come right on time. Look at that man, bloated by self-importance, full of himself, but soul empty. But the person in right standing before God, through loyal and steady believing, is fully alive, really alive. Note well, money deceives. The arrogant rich don't last. They are more hungry for wealth than the grave is for cadavers. Like death, they always want more. But the more they get is dead bodies. They are cemeteries filled with dead nations, graveyards filled with corpses. Don't give people like this a second thought. Soon the whole world will be taunting them. They will taunt, who do you think you are? Getting rich by stealing and exploitation. How long do you think you can get away with this? Indeed, how long before your victims wake up, stand up, and make you the victim? You've plundered nation after nation. Now you'll get a taste of your own medicine. All the survivors are out to plunder you, a payback for all your murders and massacres. Who do you think you are, recklessly grabbing and looting, living it up, acting like the king of the mountain, acting above it all, above trials and troubles? You've engineered the ruin of your own house. In ruining others, you've ruined yourself. You've undermined your foundations, rotted your own soul. The bricks of your house will speak up and accuse you. The woodwork will step forward with evidence. Who do you think you are, building a town by murder, a city with crime? Don't you know God of the angel armies makes sure nothing comes of that but ashes? Make sure the harder you work at that kind of thing, the less you are. Meanwhile, the earth fills up with awareness of God's glory as waters cover the sea. This is the word of the Lord. The problem is God gave Habakkuk to see it. I love that language. I love the way that starts. I love that phrasing. The problem, as God gave Habakkuk to see it, is about economic injustice, economic violence, a rigged economic system that causes abusive economic inequality. That's the problem. And the answer, as God gave Habakkuk to see it, maybe you don't expect that kind of stuff in the Bible, to burn it all down. Scholars aren't sure, but they think Habakkuk preached and wrote about the same time as Jeremiah, very near the end of the 7th century BCE, right about the time when what remained of Israel had become such a mess, just soaked in this hideous marriage of internal government corruption and immoral religious hypocrisy. And both Habakkuk and Jeremiah, they preached and they wrote just before all that would blow up into such a social dumpster fire that the Babylonian army sauntered down, took over Jerusalem, marched all the important people across the desert into exile, for which Habakkuk must have felt like singing, I told you so, I told you so. See, some scholars think he sang that because Habakkuk sung these words, probably not to Bob Dylan's tune, although St. Bob certainly knew something about looking out over his own watchtower of the brokenness of the world. But scholars think that Habakkuk sung these words because he seems to have been a temple musician of some sort. And just like the book of Psalms is just a whole collection of songs, it looks like these are maybe Habakkuk's, it's 3 chapters, so maybe Habakkuk's 3 best songs, maybe his 3 best protest songs. Now the problem, as God gave Jeremiah to see it, is exactly the same. Jeremiah saw the same things. And Jeremiah disagreed with kings and leaders of Israel at that time. He saw corruption and immorality, and he saw crippling economic inequality, but instead of protest songs calling for victims to stand up, and unlike other prophets, unlike Hosea, who compared the government to a whore, and Amos, who threatened religious hypocrites with a day of judgment, or Elijah, who actually killed a lot of the enemy within, or Ezekiel's performance art, or Micah's theatrical metaphor, or Jonah's tragic comedy, or Daniel, who just had a psychedelic trip. Instead of all that, Jeremiah had a soft approach. Not that Daniel. Daniel in the Bible. Read it. It's like a psychedelic trip, I promise. But all those people were kind of wild. Jeremiah was soft. He was calm. Some of you would have liked Jeremiah. You maybe wish I would be more like Jeremiah. The book of Jeremiah is basically a kind of a journal. And it's a journal about trying to reason calmly with stubborn kings. And he prayed for patience so he could show them a better way. He had such patience. He worked for decades. Most prophets, they worked for a little bit and they burned out and they were done. Jeremiah just kept going for decade after decade, trying to get people to calm their anger because God has a plan. 29:11, plans for your welfare and not for harm, plans to give you a future of hope. A future of hope. I believe in that. Do you want a future of hope? Does anyone in this life want a future with hope in it? Of course we want that. And thank God we have Jeremiah to point us there softly. But if Jeremiah was Martin, Habakkuk was Malcolm. And nothing of lasting value ever gets done without Martins of this world, and nothing gets done without Malcolms of this world. The problem, as God gave Habakkuk to see it, quote, look at that man, loaded with self-importance, full of himself, with soul empty. Who does he think he is, grabbing them by the poverty? God will turn that to ashes. That man, by the way, Habakkuk is not pointing to any particular man. Some of us want him to be pointing to a particular man, but sorry, he's not. He's not pointing to King Jeconiah or King Jehoiakim. I had to look those up. I didn't know him any more than you. He's not pointing to any of the kings of their time or our time. It'd be too easy. If he pointed specifically, that would be buried as historical. It'd be ignored. King worshippers wouldn't accept it. So instead, this is not about any one man, because it's about the man. He's talking to the man. Habakkuk points to a system so self-righteously in charge, holding everyone down, using every trick in the book to keep people from seeing the foot on their own necks. But he knows. Habakkuk knows. And he writes it in big, bold letters, like a billboard, so you can see it when you're driving by. Writes it big enough so even when you're in a hurry to pay attention, you can't help but miss it. You see it when you're running away. You see it when you're so stuck in the rat race to make enough that it's really hard to stop and say, that's enough. Habakkuk tells us in hostile hopefulness that God is never on the side of a man, because the man is always on the side of power, and power always turns to abusing the powerless, and God is always on the side of the powerless. I'll say that again so you can write notes and mix it up however you want. But God is never on the side of the man, because the man is always on the side of power, and power always turns to abusing the powerless, and God is always on the side of the powerless. The problem is God gave Jesus to see it. You know what it is? Exactly the same thing. Some of you want to see Jesus more like Jeremiah. Always finding a clever way to challenge authority without mirroring violence, which is true. Jesus was like that. Some of you see Jesus more like Habakkuk, calling for such a moral and faithful reorientation of the heart that the whole system will blow up, which is true. Jesus was like that. The last will be first, and the first will be... Yeah, Dylan stole that line too. He seems to be just cherry picking from the Bible. Some of you know Jesus' first sermon. for which he was dragged out of his home church to be thrown off a cliff by people who were so committed. They were so committed to the middle ground and trying to hold some center in a tilting and crumbling world. Some of you know what he said that threatened them with his message. He said, I come to bring good news to the poor. I come to proclaim release to the captives, to sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free. I mean, listen to that revolutionary stuff. It's prioritizing the poor, not the rich. It's prison reform rather than tough on crime. It's health care. It's, instead of figure it out on your own, it's social justice for the oppressed, not stigmatizing and bullying them. But I left one out. Anyone know what I left out? Anyone? Before he closed the scroll and sat down, Jesus ended his first sermon by saying he also came to, quote, proclaim the year of Jubilee. Year of Jubilee. Anyone know what that is?
Party.
A party? It would be a party. That would be a great party because it's this Jewish concept, which, let's just point out, no one knows if it ever actually happened. Jesus said this. We have no evidence that anyone actually followed it. But it's this idea that's so worth partying for. It's this idea that after 50 years, all the debts in the country wiped clean. All the debts wiped clean. That is economically wild. You're too poor to finance your education? Not anymore. Your family's been stuck in a cycle of poverty forever? Not anymore. You can't get ahead when rich people are designed and empowered to prey on your poverty? Enough of that. Forgive us our debts, as we forgive our... What if he meant that literally? Oh, but Hansen, how would the modern economy work that way? Exactly. Oh, but Hansen, how would bankers be incentivized to make loans? I don't know, they'd find a way. Oh, but Hansen, how could the wealthy reinvest their profits? Reinvest their profits? Yes. How would they reinvest? That's there, they reinvest their profits. What if Jesus meant what he said? That according to God's loving dream, the system should take care of the poor first, rather than protecting the rich. What if he meant what he said? That we should do the same for the poor, not just with charity, but with justice. Not just economic jubilee, good news to the poor, prison reform, health care for all, but also the answer, as God gave Jesus to see it, was let the oppressed go free. And what does that mean, the oppressed? Who are they? We're going to close in on here on Dennis's passage to say who are the oppressed in that time. Because the problem is God gave it to Paul to see, and Dennis just read, the problem of oppression as he saw it could be explained, and was explained, through three social situations. This isn't all oppression, but how Paul understood the big three that they wrestled with, and I'm sure they were so backwards back in those days that we've really followed through and fixed all this. But first, the people of Paul's day and Jesus' day were caught up in divisions between Jews and Gentiles. His church was caught up in divisions between Hebrew people and Roman people. People who came from here and came from there. People who looked like this and looked like this. Paul saw God trying to bring folks together, but for some reason, the world was fixated on racial distinctions. So if you take notes, write this down. The first problem of oppression that Paul saw was genetic nonsense. And it's one that haunts our world today. Just this week calls for the KKK to ride again, because black lives don't matter and brown lives belong behind walls. Second, the people of Paul's and Jesus' day were caught up in divisions between slave and free. In other words, Paul's church was caught up in divisions between the poor and the rich, working class and those elites. He saw God trying to bring folks together, but for some reason, the world was stuck on this idea, this terrible idea that a few wealthy people deserve more. More power, more money, more everything, until enough is enough. If you take notes, write down oligarchic economy, the second problem of oppression that Paul saw, and the one that continues to destroy lives today in such insidious ways that the people most hurt are often the ones most eager to keep it going, most easily outfoxed by the media and special interest, most egregiously oppressed and oppressors. Third, the people of Paul's and Jesus' day were caught up in divisions between male and female. Paul's church was caught up in divisions over gender. Paul saw God trying to bring folks together. He watched the stories of Jesus believing women, protecting women, empowering women, respecting women. But for some reason, the world couldn't get there, or wouldn't. So if you take notes, write down patriarchal baloney. The third problem that Paul saw and the one that remains a virus today. In Christ's family, there can be no division between Jew and Gentile, slave and free, male and female. That's the answer as God gave Paul to see it. Now, given that answer, I believe that you and God can figure out what to do with it so that the earth can fill up with God's glory like the seas cover the ocean. I believe you and God can figure out how to address justice before Habakkuk's vision comes true, as it does every time we let genetic, oligarchical, patriarchal abuse have its way for too long. I believe, I trust, I have faith that we can do justice in this world by really loving our neighbors. I believe it, so we can prove it. Amen.